So if you haven't watched that video on the shorthand, some of what I'm going to say might not make sense to you, right? Check out that video. It's about 14 minutes long, but it gives you some visuals that help convey the trends tied to certain terminology, right? And what I want to be able to do today is just walk through the responses we should expect to see at these different time points, show you which context clues to pick up on in the scenario. I don't know if I'll finish the entire scenario today. If I don't, I'll post the video as it is, and then just know that the next video is going to pick up where we left off, okay? But I want to be able to post each lecture so that you've got something to review. Does that sound good? All right, so our scenario for today is, oh, and by the way, Zoom folks, doing something a little bit different today. So Amber is not on the other side of the iPad. Sometimes when you have questions, you'll raise your hands or you'll do the chat thing. She's not there. So if you have a question, just speak up so that I can hear, okay? I'm assuming that's good, so. Jacob, you can kind of see that. So if you happen to see anything, do you mind letting me know? Yeah. Awesome, I appreciate that. Isabel's your backup. Okay, so our scenario today, I'll pull this back down so I don't have to look up. This is me swimming, which is an oxymoron because that doesn't happen very often. And I'm doing that for 40 minutes, okay? That's our general activity. Now, some clues that you need to know are that my exercise intensity is very easy. Oh, I'm sorry, I've just listed it as easy, okay? Also understand that the intensity or the pace of exercise is consistent the entire time, meaning that this sense of easy intensity, it's unwavering. So there's no fatigue. That's basically what you're going to be reading into this. I won't be discussing the fatigue context with any scenarios this week, but we will next week. So what you should know is if it's easy and the pace is consistent and it says it feels easy the whole time, you should be thinking, okay, there's no fatigue happening here. Okay? Lastly, it's important to note that I remain cool, meaning like my body temperature is cool, and I'm well hydrated the entire time. Again, this sets up a foundation for another context layer that I'll discuss starting next week on Monday. But today, we just need to know that that sounds great. There's nothing to do in response to that. Cool? So that sets the stage. Now we need to look at how to describe those responses at onset. Now in your Ninja notes, what you'll see is there's a large swath of content that basically says this will be taught live. And what you'll see for the neuromuscular physiology during exercise, or the onset piece, is it says that the amount and the type of motor units that you are recruiting is dependent on exercise intensity. So if we go back to that neuromuscular lab when we talked about motor unit recruitment, remember that at low levels of force output, you wouldn't be utilizing very many motor units. And at the higher level force outputs, that's when you're adding the 2A and the 2X. Is that ringing some bells for y'all? So now you have to describe that. And I think to get us all on the same page, we'll use some universal language. Right? If it's an easy exercise intensity, let's just say that you are recruiting a few motor units. Okay? Just so that we're all on the same page. So I'm going to write few. Notice I'm going to put a blank here for a second. I'll come back to this. Few MUs for motor units recruited. Again, on Zoom, if this doesn't look clear, it will be on the recorded footage. Now, what type of motor units am I recruiting then? Because that's dependent on intensity as well. If I'm recruiting just a few motor units, what type do you think they are? Type 1, because that's always the first. We would have to be recruiting, say, a lot of motor units for us to do all the type 1s and then something above that. So if it's just a few, then you can put type 1. I'm going to abbreviate that as T1. So a few type 1 motor units recruited. I've described two things about neuromuscular recruitment at onset, a few and type 1. There's one last thing I can speak to, and that's rate coding. Remember that rate coding can speed up as force output has to increase. So in this situation, easy intensity typically means low force output. So a good descriptor for that might be slow rate coding. So I'll put slow rate coding, and I'll abbreviate it as RC just for simplicity here. So if you go back to your Ninja notes, it says the type and the amount of motor units recruited is dependent on intensity. Your context clue is easy, and what we're sort of agreeing to, at least unilaterally, is that easy means a few type 1 motor units, and it also means we're utilizing slow rate coding. That's 1, 2, 3 things that you can speak to for onset neuromuscular Phyz, or neuromuscular system. Make sense so far? So let's see what's happening for metabolism. What I would like you to comment on is the dominant system, which I'll simply abbreviate as DOM-Sys for now. First few seconds of activity, first few seconds, what do you think is the most dominant system? The immediate, right? It's in the name. It's immediate. This is energy that you've got right now before glycolysis really ramps up or before mitochondrial respiration really ramps up. So we're going to put immediate system here as our dominant system. And I'll let you in on a little secret. The only context you need to answer this is that it's the onset. This could have been a different mode of exercise, a different duration, easy, moderate, high intensity. It doesn't matter. For every single scenario I give you, every single scenario, this is your answer for the dominant system at onset, because we're just talking the first few seconds, and immediate will always be dominant in that time frame. Does that make sense? Now, if we have a dominant system, that also means we have a dominant fuel source. So I'm just going to put DOM fuel, whoops. And what are the fuel sources for the immediate system? Yep, stored ATP and creatine phosphate. So I'm going to write those in real quick. Stored ATP and CRP. Okay. Just like the immediate, this is going to be your answer for every scenario I throw at you, because these are the fuel sources for that. Something else to write about. Remember that when the immediate system is dominant, there's some triggers that would enhance glycolytic activity. Do you remember that? Just out of curiosity, what are those two triggers? Muscle contraction and AMP buildup, right? So we know that if we're using this, glycolytic activity should be increasing, and that's what I want you to comment on as it relates to metabolism. So the terminology I would like you to use is basically, remember, this is the shorthand. I'm going to use an up arrow for increasing or enhancing. Increasing, we're going to parse out glycolytic activity into two processes. One is going to be glycogenolysis. This is how we're freeing up G6P. Increasing glycogenolysis and glycolysis. This is where we're using glucose and G6P. So together, this is what I'm referring to with enhanced glycolytic activity, which is what you learned when you studied the immediate system. Okay? So there's one last thing I'd like you to speak to as it relates to metabolism at onset, and that's what's happening with mitochondrial respiration. Remember, we're always using mitochondrial respiration at any point in time. Even in the first few seconds, it would be kind of ramping up a little bit. But how do we do that? I mean, when you think about it, first few seconds, It's not like you have the time to start taking a bunch of extra breaths. We're just talking about like 3 seconds, right? How many more breaths can you actually take? How many more heartbeats are you going to get in that first second to really support oxygen delivery for mitochondrial respiration? Really nothing, right? So what that means is if mitochondrial respiration was to increase, we have to be able to provide extra oxygen for that somewhere, and we do that by using stored oxygen on myoglobin. So what I would typically write this as is I would say use stored O2 on MB for myoglobin for, I'm going to use an up arrow, for increasing MR for mitochondrial respiration. And by the way, these abbreviations and stuff that you're learning here, you can use these on your quiz, or you can use these on the exam down the road, right? At this point in time, I'm assuming you know what these things mean. Okay. Using stored O2 on MB for increasing MR on the DL. Yo, there we go. I thought that was funny. Anyway, so onset, we've covered neuromuscular now. We've covered metabolism. These 4 for metabolism, always the same. Every single scenario I'll throw at you. It doesn't matter how long, doesn't matter the mode, doesn't matter the intensity. It's always these 4, really because we're just talking the first few seconds. Okay? So you memorize it once, and you're good to go for everything I'll throw at you. Cool? All right, let's talk about cardiovascular. There was a lot of parameters that we learned for print. And so what I'm going to do is basically use an up arrow. And what this is supposed to convey in the onset context is increasing. Emphasis on ing. Things are going up presently. Now remember that there's an exercise pressor reflex. And that occurs in these first few seconds of activity. As soon as you move, muscle contraction spurs the reflex, which means that sympathetic activity upregulates, and anything tied to increase SNS activity would also probably upregulate. So that's going to include things like heart rate and cardiac output, systemic vasoconstriction, and so on. So let's just go ahead and list those out. So I'm going to put heart rate, stroke volume, ejection fraction, cardiac output, rate pressure product. These are all those heart-based parameters we learned. And then if we look on the blood pressure side, we're going to see systolic blood pressure go up, diastolic blood pressure go up. Those help calculate or determine mean arterial pressure. So that means mean arterial pressure is going to go up. If those both go up, that usually means that SVR, systemic vascular resistance, goes up. So I'm going to add that into our increasing list. And it's worth mentioning that I am doing aerobic exercise. Oh, wait a minute. I forgot. I'm sorry. Diastolic blood pressure doesn't go up. My fault. I wrote that wrong. I got a little ahead of myself. So, we are doing aerobic exercise. What was the trend you remembered for SVR with aerobic exercise? What happens to it compared to rest? Anyone? It goes down, right? Now, in this onset context, I'm listing it as going up. And the reason for that is that SVR usually is lower than rest with aerobic exercise during exercise once the EDRFs have been released to open up some highways. That hasn't happened yet because it's only been a few seconds. In fact, the reason this is going up is because with this first few seconds, we see an upregulation of SNS activity, which means that there should be, I'll just abbreviate it as systemic vasoconstriction. technically it's vasoconstriction, but systemic vasoconstriction. Remember, everything is being told to shut down. But in time, the EDRs will open stuff up, and we'll acknowledge that over here in our during time point. Okay. So I've used one up arrow to indicate increasing for 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 things. This is 9 things to report on for cardiovascular. Now, what about diastolic blood pressure? I haven't mentioned that yet. Remember that during aerobic exercise, diastolic blood pressure tends to be unchanged. So if you refer to the shorthand video, unchanged, I'm just going to use a dash for that. And you could do that. You could easily type a dash when you're doing a quiz if that helps you. So I'll put an unchanged diastolic blood pressure. When we get into resistance training, we'll see a different response there. But we are talking about aerobic training. So the context to be picking up here for the cardiovascular box at onset is really 2 things. The first is the time frame. Because of the time frame, you should be expecting the exercise pressor reflex to occur. And because of that upregulation of SNS, a lot of things are going up. The second piece of context is that this is aerobic exercise performed at an easy intensity, which is why diastolic blood pressure is unchanged rather than going up. When you see a scenario on Wednesday, where I'll do a resistance training one, you're going to see it, that this is added to that list. Okay? Make sense? Questions on this so far? Okay. Let's talk about the respiratory system then. So with the respiratory system, there's not as many parameters as it relates to exercise. And the exercise pressor reflex affects those parameters as well. So with SNS upregulation, you would expect to see increasing ventilation, tidal volume, breathing frequency, and bronchodilation. What I'm going to do here is I'm going to space these out into 2 chunks, and you'll see why here in a second. So I'm going to put an up arrow for increasing ventilation. I'm going to leave that on sort of its own line. And then I'm also going to do an up arrow for the breathing frequency, for the tidal volume, and bronchodilation. We're opening up our airways a little bit, so I'll just put that right here. This all happens in response to that SNS upregulation. Now, it's worth mentioning, I keep talking about exercise pressor reflex here. That's not the answer, so to speak. If I said describe what's happening for CV or respiratory Phyz at onset, I wouldn't be expecting you to say exercise pressor reflex. That's not the answer. That sort of helps explain why these are going up. What you see here, these are the answers. Okay. Now, why did I do ventilation on its own line? Because ventilation can increase at different rates. And I want to make sure this is on camera here, so let's see here. All right. So, generally speaking, if this is ventilation on this graph, and we have low exercise intensity, moderate exercise intensity, or high exercise intensity. Remember what you've learned thus far is that how hard you breathe is dependent on the intensity, right? And that's why we can use the talk test. So around lactate threshold, you start to breathe hard enough that you don't talk that much. And then past lactate threshold, you're breathing so hard you don't talk, right? What we saw from the data in that LT VO2 max episode was that ventilation increased with intensity, and then once we got past lactate threshold, it started to really increase. And if I was to describe this early trend versus this late trend, I would describe this early trend as a proportionate increase, meaning it's linear. And I would describe this later trend at past lactate threshold as a disproportionate increase, meaning it's exponential. So what we're going to have to do as a class is basically agree on an intensity that clearly tells you is ventilation increasing proportionately or disproportionately. Okay? Here's what the context should be. I want you to understand that proportionate would basically be anything that is less than lactate threshold, which will typically be these low, moderate intensities. And disproportionate would be anything that is at or greater than lactate threshold. So what I'll often do on my scenarios is I'll say exercise intensity is easy or moderate or whatever, and then I'll also add in context, and I'll say in this case easy under lactate threshold, right? So that you've basically got a double whammy. You can say, okay, it's easy, I think that's proportionate. It's under lactate threshold, definitely proportionate. So what that means is not only are you describing that ventilation is increasing at onset, you're saying that that is a proportionate increase. Again, the context for this really is the intensity. If this was a high intensity scenario, we would be describing this as disproportionate. And it's worth mentioning, the only reason I'm even saying proportionate or disproportionate is because this up arrow is to imply increasing, present tense. Is it increasing proportionately or is it increasing disproportionately? In the during scenario, sometimes we're using more of a past tense type of thing where the proportionate, disproportionate doesn't make sense, but you'll see that here soon enough. Does that make sense so far? So, at onset, you have now taken the information from your Ninja notes in each of those different systems. You'll see that it sort of words that information generically, and it's now applied very specifically due to the context that's provided in this scenario. And when I give you a different scenario on Wednesday, you'll see that some of this will change. Okay? Make sense? Cool. Let's move on to our during exercise responses. So the during exercise responses, again, I'm always going to choose a time point for you. I've chosen 30 minutes in to this 40-minute workout. And what I want to remind you all is that the intensity has not changed. From here to there, the intensity's been the same. And that intensity is still easy, which means it's still below lactate threshold. So when we try to describe the neuromuscular recruitment here, whatever you've listed here applies here. You wouldn't say that you're recruiting all type 1 motor units now, or all type 1 and some 2A, because that would imply that either fatigue is happening, which it's not, or that the intensity has somehow increased, which it hasn't. Does that make sense? Again, we'll add those layers in next week. Right now, this is a simple one. It's easy, nothing's changed, so everything you see here is the same. And what I'm simply going to do is put same as onset just for brevity here. What I want you to do on your end is write the exact same stuff, right? Just so you can drill it in, right? And I want you to understand why it's the same as onset. The context is nothing's changed. Okay? There's no fatigue, intensity is still the same. Now, We're now 30 minutes into this. 30 minutes is a long time. I would like for you to also describe the dominant system. So I'll put dom-sys again. What do you think the dominant system is 30 minutes into this swimming workout? Mitochondrial respiration, no doubt. So let's go ahead and put MR for a mitochondrial respiration. And like the onset, I want you to indicate what the dominant fuel source is. Ooh, this is a tricky one. Because remember when I tested VO2 max, I started at an easy intensity and I finished at a high intensity. And the dominant macronutrient fuel changed during that time point. Y'all remember that? So on the front end, when it was really easy, what was the dominant fuel source? Lipids, right? And we used RER to help verify that. Typically when it's less than 0.8, you're lipid dominant. Near the end, what was my dominant fuel source? Jesus? Carbs, right? RER again helped verify that once it gets above 0.9. So, different person this time. Lactate threshold. Does anyone remember the RER that's roughly used to guess where lactate threshold is? Here's a clue. It's higher than 0.9. Someone say that again? 1. Who said that? Awesome. Thanks, Isabel. So about 1.0. So we can use some context here, right? Easy intensity. Under lactate threshold. That should be suggesting to you that RER is very low. So that in this case, we would list our dominant fuel as lipids. I'll be the first to acknowledge that once you start to get up into this moderate intensity range, it can start to become a little bit of a toss-up. Is it carbs? Is it lipids? What I'll always do is I'll give you some clue or context that makes it obvious what the answer should be. So let's just say I said moderate, and you're like, well, is that 0.9, whatever? I'll probably tell you, well below lactate threshold, or at lactate. If I say I was at or greater than lactate threshold, you already know that's above 0.9. So then it's a dead ringer, right? So I'll try to provide the context that makes it very obvious. You don't feel like you're having to guess, right? But you got to know what that context is. Cool? So in this case, easy, I always want you to be interpreting easy as dominant system mitochondrial respiration, dominant fuel lipids. Cool? Now, there is something I referred to during metabolism, but it becomes more appropriate to speak to now. And that's the fact that we're still using carbohydrates during this exercise session, even though lipids are dominant. It doesn't mean that you're not using carbs, right? They're just a slightly smaller piece of the puzzle. Well, what that means is we're using carbohydrate metabolism, and there's some processes tied to that. We're certainly using glycolysis, because that's how we process the carbs. But it also means that we are, I'm totally lost my train of thought. We have to get the carbohydrate from something. And remember that most of our carbohydrates are stored in the form of glycogen, right? So in order to free that up, we use glycogenolysis. And what we derive is not really glucose, but glucose 6-phosphate. Well, this is sort of an interesting new point for you all to learn, right? And we're going to acknowledge it here. They used to think, when I say used, like 25 years ago, they used to think that whatever glycogen stores you had in your body heading into an exercise session, that was the fuel tank that you started with, and you just started to sip from that fuel tank. What we now know is that you are adding to your glycogen reserves during exercise. So that if you were drinking Gatorade, that's a carbohydrate beverage. If you were eating a power bar that has carbohydrates, any carbohydrate consumption that you have during exercise doesn't go just to glucose, which then would go into glycolysis. Rather, most of the carbohydrates you ingest during exercise actually goes to form new glucose. And we call that glycogenesis. So you're forming new glycogen, while at the exact same time you're splitting apart glycogen. And the net effect of that is you have a really steady supply of not glucose but G6P for your carbohydrate metabolism, which, tying in with your ATP math, you get more ATP out of that. Does that make sense? So all that being said, the point that I want you to acknowledge is that glycogenesis and glycogenolysis are both happening at the same time. Now, this is during exercise, and it seems that the exercise intensity is very stable. So the terminology that I introduced in your video would be elevated but stable. So you can use your up arrow, which basically means that these things are higher than they were, but they're now relatively stable, right? So up arrow, BS, and I'm just going to put glycogenesis and glycogenolysis. And that's different than what we had over here at onset with glycogenolysis and glycolysis. Now this is glycogenesis and glycogenolysis, right? That's the point I'm trying to emphasize here. The last thing that I want to mention, we are below lactate threshold. You are producing lactate, no doubt about it. You're producing lactate and protons, but you're not producing very much of them, which means it's very easy to shuttle all that stuff out of the muscle so that we don't get a buildup that would cause fatigue. Okay? So let's acknowledge that in some way. I think a great way to do that would basically say lactate and protons are shuttled out of muscle. You'll see that that changes when we start talking about fatigue, where we'll refer more to lactate and proton accumulation in the muscle. Right now we're simply acknowledging that it's being made and we're getting rid of it as fast as it's being made. Still hanging in there with me? Okay. So let's transition to our CV system. On the CV side, there's a lot of things that were increasing at onset that are now going to be elevated but stable. Okay? And well, take that back. That's the wrong one. I'll put this over here. So what would be elevated but stable? Well, all of our heart-based parameters for sure will be. So heart rate, stroke volume, ejection fraction, cardiac output, rate pressure product. Means that we're saying that they're higher than they were here, but they're now roughly stable. Okay, that's the trend. Systolic blood pressure and mean arterial pressure, those are also elevated but stable. And this systemic vasoconstriction, remember this was happening at onset because of the increased sympathetic output. At this time point, SNS and PSNS are starting to balance one another out. So what that means is there's definitely some command for systemic vasoconstriction, but it's not an increasing command, right? Wherever that systemic vasoconstriction is, it's basically being maintained. So we could add that to our elevated but stable list. I'm going to abbreviate it on this side, and I'm just going to put SysVC for systemic vasoconstriction, just to try and fit this in the box a little bit easier. Okay. Now I mentioned that we are doing aerobic exercise, and with aerobic exercise, typically diastolic blood pressure remains unchanged. 30 minutes in, it's still that way. So I'm going to put a dash here, and I'm going to put diastolic blood pressure remains unchanged. And because it's aerobic exercise, and because we're 30 minutes in, EDRFs have now been released to locally vasodilate, which means our SVR, which was going up at onset, is now decreased but stable. So I'm going to use a little down arrow, but stable, and I'm going to put SVR. Man, I can't write, sorry. And there's one more point I'd like for you to acknowledge here, and that's, since we're acknowledging the systemic vasoconstriction, let's acknowledge the EDRF thing. So let's just put EDRFs elicit local vasodilation. Vasodilation. I didn't abbreviate it VD there just because it's the first time I'm writing it, right? So we've now acknowledged a ton of different things about the cardiovascular system. Let's now move on to the respiratory system to do the same, okay? So on the respiratory side, basically everything that was increasing before is also now elevated but stable, okay? So I'm going to do my up arrow again with the BS, and I'm going to put ventilation, breathing frequency, tidal volume, and bronchodilation, which I'll abbreviate as BD here. And I want to emphasize that we're saying that these things increased compared to here, but they're now stable. So what that means is I don't have to describe if this ventilation is proportional or disproportional, because that only makes sense if something's increasing. But if it's not increasing now, if it's stable, those terms are irrelevant. So it would just be elevated but stable. Make sense? So that proportionate, disproportionate, always applicable at onset when we see an increasing ventilation. Next week when we start adding fatigue into the mix, sometimes we see that it's actually elevated but increasing, then it would be appropriate again. But right now that doesn't apply. Hanging in there with me? Great. Let's try to finish this off a smidge. See, we've got just enough time, I think. So, I am now done with my exercise. Let's just say this is 5 minutes after, or more. Okay? Doesn't really matter when, to be honest with you. How would you describe the neuromuscular recruitment? Well, the beauty of this is you don't. At this point in time, I'm beached out on the side of the pool, starfish style, because I'm done. I'm not recruiting anything. So, early Christmas present for y'all, right? Nothing. You don't have to put anything there because you're not recruiting anything. On the metabolism side, it's very difficult sometimes. So usually the dominant system is mitochondrial respiration. It's like such a given. But I think what I'd rather have you focus on is some specific aspects about that mitochondrial respiration. And in your shorthand video, I talked about the terms C2E and C2R. So C2E means compared to exercise, and C2R means compared to rest. So typically, we talked about epoch before metabolism. Epoch has greater emphasis here now. So if I have a graph of mitochondrial respiration, and at rest, it was about right here, and then I started exercising, right? So I'll put exercise right here, and I saw that mitochondrial respiration was elevated but stable. Now post-exercise, what we'd see is that mitochondrial respiration comes back down. But what you should note is that mitochondrial respiration is decreased compared to exercise, but it's increased compared to rest. That's epoch, right? So what I'll list here, you can do this a variety of ways. You could say MR decreased C2E, but increased C2R. right? You're acknowledging the epoch is occurring. Make sense? I want to talk about a carbohydrate metabolism point because we've mentioned that all throughout so far. And this carbohydrate point is that you're using carbohydrates during exercise. It doesn't matter if lipids are dominant. You're definitely using carbohydrates, which means you need to replenish them afterwards. New little trivia for you is that there's a window of time post-exercise of about 20 to 30 minutes when you can synthesize or replenish glycogen better than normal. You do it at faster rates. For that reason, anytime you exercise, if you want to fuel up the fill tank as fast as you can, eat something with carbohydrates in, drink something with carbohydrates in it in that 20 to 30 minute window. It just gives you a jump start on the replenishment of carbohydrates, right? Doesn't care what it is. Candy, something actually nutritious, if it's got carbs, it's good in that 20 to 30 minute window, okay? So that being said, we want to acknowledge that there is some increased glucose and glycogen synthesis post-exercise, and we'll do that with an up arrow increasing, and then I'm going to put gluconeogenesis because that's the formation of new glucose. And glycogenesis, which is the formation of glycogen. There's a third point that I'd like to mention. We were creating lactate and protons during exercise. We were getting rid of them, right? And it wasn't accumulating. Anything that resides in the muscles post-exercise, we get rid of. So it's basically the same point, but you might say excess lactate and protons shuttled out of muscles. Okay. All right. See, I'm running out of time. I might take just a couple extra minutes, and I apologize for that. But I'm going to cover CV and respiratory at the same because they can do it well. Basically, anything that was increased during exercise is going to come back down. Anything that was decreased during exercise, like this SVR, is going to come back up. And if they were increased and they're coming down, it's going to be the same as this mitochondrial respiration. Decreased compared to exercise, but increased compared to rest. So when you see that you've got epoch happening, the way you support that epoch is just a slightly higher heart rate. Just a little bit more ventilation. Not too noticeable, but it is a little bit higher, right? So we're going to use this language. I'm just going to put decreased C2E, increased C2R, and anything that was elevated but stable is going to go in that list. So that's going to be my heart rate, stroke volume, ejection fraction, cardiac output, rate pressure product, systolic blood pressure, mean arterial pressure, and systemic vasoconstriction. Okay. Diastolic blood pressure was unchanged the entire time. Still unchanged. So I can put my dash, DBP. And remember the SVR went down during exercise, so it's got to come back. So now it's increased compared to exercise, but it's decreased compared to rest. Just like that. And my decrease compared to exercise, but increase compared to rest is applicable to everything here on the respiratory side that was increased, right? So decreased C2E, increased C2R, and I've got ventilation, breathing frequency, tidal volume, and bronchodilation. Look at that, 1120. So, in summary, you've got a scenario And what I'm asking you to do is take the content in your Ninja notes, apply that by system for different time points based on the context or clues in the scenario. Now, there's a lot of other stuff going on, right? I am just trying to emphasize what I think are some really important points, right? So the best way to study this is to practice it, right? We're going to do another scenario on Wednesday. We'll do another scenario on next Monday and another one. I'm going to give you at least 4. SI is going to have some more. And what we're really going to try to emphasize is what are the things that you're pulling out that would change your responses scenario to scenario, okay? Cool? All right, that's it. Have a great day, folks. I'll post this probably by the end of the day, so you've got it for your review. Take care. Everyone on Zoom, have a good one.